So again, thanks to Meta for organizing this, and I truly believe that this is the sort of space that is needed to discuss, to think outside the box, to brainstorm about what possible solutions we can find to thorny, complex issues like nuclear disarmament. That it is in the best interest of everybody to come up with creative ideas and doable ideas, and that can be implemented. I think they might come from where you least expected. And I think this is important. It should also matter not only as human beings, because nuclear disarmament is a concern that should preoccupy everybody on Earth, but also as Canadians. It's important to have a sense of what our government is doing to help or hinder nuclear disarmament efforts internationally, and it's good to have that. And this sort of event also I think stimulates a sense of a desire for accountability and democratic responsiveness of the government to the concerns that are articulated by civil society, by academia, by experts, by just general concerned citizens. So yeah, thank you, Meta, for organizing this. My talk today is the topic Meta gave me initially was proliferation and control issues like that. I'm going to frame it as the unfulfilled promise of nuclear abolition, and I prepared my talk for a general audience. I'm going to go over certain issues that I think are relevant, each of which could warrant its own separate lecture. So just to caution you that this is a bird's eye view of what I think are key dynamics and trends currently shaping nuclear disarmament discussions. And I encourage you to stop me, interrupt me, challenge me. I mean, you don't need to wait till the end. If you hear something that you would like clarification about, or you would like to add something, by all means, just jump in. I'm happy to do it, not offended or anything like that. 2015 is a critical year. 70th anniversary of Hiroshima, 45th anniversary of the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, coming into force. Over a quarter of a century since the end of the Cold War. And it is a year when the 2015 review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is going to be held in May in New York City at the United Nations. So there's a lot going on in the nuclear realm. So I think it's very timely, and I don't think it's an overstatement to say that 2015, in the current environment, in the current state of affairs, is going to shape up to be a critical year for nuclear disarmament efforts internationally. What's funny about the nuclear disarmament issue is that we know what the answer is to every problem related to nuclear disarmament. I'm talking about the test ban treaty, I'm talking about proliferation pressures, I'm talking about FMCT. The solution is the total, complete, irreversible of nuclear weapons.
FMCT is?
A fissile material cutoff treaty, and I will get into that a little bit later on in my presentation. But all the ills are byproducts of the existence of nuclear weapons. You can draw a line, a direct line. You can trace every one of the ills of the global nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime to the very existence of nuclear weapons. So I think that's one thing to have in mind as a baseline, that is the root of the problem. The problem with the existence of nuclear weapons is the existence of nuclear weapon. But this is also a testament that knowing the answer to a problem is not sufficient. It's not sufficient to solve it. Knowing the answer is not enough. We not only know the answer, we know how to get there. We know that there must be a multilateral, non-discriminatory convention towards the elimination of nuclear weapons, by any name. It can be called a Nuclear Weapons Convention. Other people have spoken of a framework of mutually reinforcing instruments, policy instruments. Whatever the name is, besides the point. There is no, from my perspective, conceivable scenario where we can arrive at zero nuclear weapons without having the international community undertake a major multilateral process that unequivocally forbids the possession and every other dimension of nuclear weaponry, and has in place a verified plan within a specific timeline for the actual elimination of existing arsenals. There's no other way that you're going to get there. a few premises that I'd like to get out of the way before I get into the issues that I want to highlight. So my talk is based on these assumptions, just so we're clear about it. And then after I've gone over these assumptions, I'm going to highlight 10 issues that I think are critical. There are others, but I narrowed it down to 10. I think these are 10 issues that if I am able today to convey to you why these 10 issues are important, how they relate to each other, and what the implications are for the global nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime, I'm going to be very happy. But we'll see at the end whether I succeed at that. But again, the premises. There will never be ideal international security conditions for nuclear disarmament. So we need to understand that. And this particular acknowledgement or realization is critical, because this is that the consideration that despite our best efforts, politically, diplomatically, civil society push, I mean, the powers that be might always delay any materialization of actually processes for nuclear disarmament with this excuse. You know, it will never be perfect. So we need, as an international community, to realize that, so that we embark on this process in international security conditions that are less than perfect. But we need to know that this is to be expected, because otherwise it will be delayed in perpetuity. There will never be ideal international security conditions. Likewise, there will always be stiff resistance to nuclear disarmament. So whoever champions this cause as a government or as an individual, as a leader of a powerful nation, etc., or as a movement, has to always prepare for the stiff resistance. And this links back to the earlier point about the lack of ideal international security conditions. So we know that there are entrenched economic interests behind nuclear disarmament. And we know there are millions of dollars worth of contracts related to nuclear disarmament. We know that the places where these contracts are executed have representatives and have senators and have popular elected representatives, so they are going to push back. There are also political reasons for pushing back. So we need, as a movement and people who are working towards nuclear disarmament, be fully prepared for this pushback and this wholly predictable resistance. This is the third one is a key one that I actually hold very close to my heart. Actual possession is much more troubling than eventual proliferation, and this is something that some states and some governments have been able to spin in such a way that it appears as if it's the other way around. That eventual proliferation, that the likelihood of someday perhaps maybe acquiring the capability to divert fissile material for military purposes is somehow more problematic than the bombs that exist today, that could go off today, that could be utilized today for warfare, or that could go off because of an accident or a miscalculation. So the problem again goes back to possession, and it is a flawed analysis to insinuate that the problem is the possibility of proliferation. Yes, there are worrisome aspects about proliferation. Yes, there are troubling trends and things that the international community needs to keep a check on. But in the end, and going back to what I said at the beginning, it goes back to possession. The fourth premise relates to the previous one. As long as nuclear weapons exist, proliferation concerns will not be fully resolved. So it's as simple as that. I mean, the primary pressure towards proliferation is the existence of nuclear weapons. So it's a very simple case of reverse engineering. If you want to ask how then would you eliminate the problem of proliferation, well, you eliminate weapons altogether in a norm that is universally applied and universally adhered to. The next premise of my presentation is the risk is real. And we need to understand this. And it's not, you know, the opinion of one peacenik or the opinion of one, you know, a conspiracy theory, this far-fetched notion that somehow there is a risk that nuclear weapons could end or severely alter civilization as we know it. No, it's not a scandalous claim. It's a real possibility. Scientists, scholars, diplomats, former statesmen, even from countries that are possessors of nuclear weapons, have all pointed to the same conclusion. There are well-documented instances of close calls, near misses, flocks of geese that have been mistaken as incoming nuclear attacks, and there has been the possibility of retaliating before getting confirmation. Weather events that may have led to accidental uses of nuclear weapons and the like. So the risk is very real. The next premise is that the solution is possible. It's doable. Otherwise, we wouldn't be pushing as hard as we have. And by we, I mean a very broad understanding of civil society, not only in Canada, but also internationally. The solution is possible. I mean, it takes the political will, this vague, ethereal, hard to define, but this crucial element for any disarmament process to move forward. There has to be a political will, but yes, it is not beyond the diplomatic capacity in the 21st century of the international community. And if it were to be, then it's quite an indictment of how far we've come diplomatically and as human beings at the United Nations level if we're not able to tackle this and address it and nip it in the bud once and for all. And the final consideration, the final premise, underlying premise that I think should also be part of this baseline understanding is that, regrettably, there is no credible process today that will lead to nuclear abolition. Not one. There are efforts, there are scattered efforts, sometimes pulling in the same direction, sometimes pulling in opposite directions. There are good people working on this. There are interested and engaged governments, diplomats. There are tireless civil society representatives that are working on different campaigns throughout the world. There is some reason for optimism, but that does not equate to a credible multilateral process that would prompt any reasonable observer in and or out of government to predict nuclear abolition in the foreseeable future. And let's be generous. I mean, in 50 years, in half a century, I mean, if you can find an authoritative person from within or without governments who will go on the record and claim that it is very likely in the next half a century to get rid of all nuclear weapons, I mean, please point them my way, because I'd be interested to talk to them, because it's really the forecast. It's really despite the efforts and despite some small victories, it really is a little bit grim and leaves a little bit to be desired. So these are the baseline premises. So the critical event this year, I would say, is the 2015 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. Just to give you a little bit of context for those of you who might not be as familiar, this is the 5-year conference. There are in-between conferences, there are preparatory committees, which are also very important and which we also track. But the big one is every 5 years, so obviously the last one was in 2010 in New York, and this is where all states parties to the nearly universal non-proliferation treaty come together in New York or Vienna or Geneva. The review conference is always in New York, and assess progress and sort of plan ahead. This year's is critical. And while I admit that this can be said of pretty much any review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty because of the gravity of the subject matter and the importance, the inherent importance of the meetings, this year really is, and I don't want to overstate it, but it is critical. It is critical. There is a generalized sense in certain quarters of impatience with the lack of progress, with the slow pace of progress by certain actors in the international community, and I think this is going to be made evident in New York. And as I go throughout the rest of the presentation, I'll give you some reasons, some specific reasons why this will likely be the case. But it is nonetheless critical. And there is no guarantee, and I wouldn't bet that there will even be an outcome document, which tends to be a key criterion under which to judge the success of review conferences, because the outcome document is a consensus document, and it's often a reflection of the ability of the states parties to the NPT that came together in New York to at least find some common ground about the priorities and the processes and the perspectives for nuclear disarmament. To give you an example, the 2005 review conferences did not arrive at a final document, at an outcome document, and it was therefore called a success, and people were disappointed. But also by comparison, the 2010 was excuse me, able to reach an outcome document, and thereby it was called a success from that perspective. But you have to take that with a grain of salt, because even with an outcome document, these tend to be very much lowest common denominator type documents that really rehash a lot of generalities, and there's little in the way of mechanisms for actual progress toward disarmament and the necessary accountability to make sure that such progress is in fact undertaken. So, as I said earlier, I'm going to talk about 10 issues. Please, Anna, in the back.
Hi, Cesar. So, if there is no outcome document, is there a history of, not for the NPT, but for other treaties, do nations just walk away from them? Does walk away from the treaties like?
Yes, I mean, the lack of an outcome document is not tantamount to a withdrawal from the treaty. I don't know if that's where you're going. I mean, no, the nations don't withdraw. In fact, the only nation that has ever withdrawn from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is North Korea, the DPRK, in 2003. And the international community was a bit befuddled, and they didn't know how to react to a withdrawal from North Korea. And to this day, they're out. It's the only country that was once in, but now they're out, so they're not officially a member. But yes, if they're not able to agree on a document, they are not able to agree on a document, and the month ends in a very predictable date, and everybody goes home without an outcome document, and there goes 5 years of progress on the nuclear disarmament file. So yeah. So 10 issues that I think are important for you to consider to grasp where we are and on this global push for nuclear abolition, and also on the pushback from other sectors. So the first issue I think is important to recognize is the humanitarian initiative. And it's not randomly that I placed this one first, but rather a reflection of the relative importance that I think it has at this moment. This has been a driving force for nuclear disarmament in recent years. So let me give you just a little bit of background information. The humanitarian imperative for disarmament essentially is the notion that says that all efforts towards nuclear abolition should be founded on the security of the individual as a human being. Not thinking, in other words, this approach drifts away a little bit from traditional rhetoric and discourse and language used about national security and deterrence and nuclear umbrellas and nuclear sharing and all these cold concepts. But we're talking more about burnt victims, people who lose all of their families in one fell swoop, people who are really going to suffer the consequences of any nuclear weapons use, and the possibility that the number of people could be vastly superior to that felt in Hiroshima or Nagasaki almost 70 years ago. So this effort to imbue the nuclear disarmament discourse with this humanitarian imperative was made evident at the 2010 NPT review conference. And this was a bit of a victory for nuclear disarmament advocates, because the language in the final document specifically referred to the need for the international community to avoid any scenario where nuclear weapons are used because of the humanitarian, the undisputable humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. So that planted the seed about the importance of this approach, this humanitarian approach. Later, And skeptics might have thought that that was the end of it, you know, one brief passing reference in the final document in 2010. But sure enough, the government of Norway hosted a conference exclusively on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. And it was well attended, it was a multilateral event, it was open to civil society. Again, skeptics might have thought that was the end of it, but halfway through this conference, the government of Mexico stepped up and they said, this is important enough for the international community that we are going to host a second conference on this same issue. And halfway through that conference, the government of Austria said, okay, we're going to get together in Vienna before the 2015 review conference and host a conference. And this last conference took place last December. And I fortunately had the opportunity to be in Oslo and in Nayarit, Mexico, and in Vienna, and to experience the growth and the enthusiasm of this initiative is really quite something. And even being aware of the difficulties that are inherent in this process, you couldn't help but feel a bit of history in the making. This sensation that people really, judging from the resolve of the people that were involved, the governments that were involved, and the individuals that were involved, you could just tell people are not letting this go. I mean, this is for the long haul, and it has been. So I think it will be reflected in May in New York during the NPT review conferences, and people are going to make several linkages between current efforts or lack thereof and the humanitarian imperative for disarmament, because the obvious conclusion from this whole humanitarian process is that something needs to be done that differs from the current approach, because we are serious about avoiding this scenario, this catastrophic scenario, so something needs to be done at the political level. This is not just a technical matter of calculating how many people will die in a single blast or how long the nuclear famine will last. This is a political matter that, based on those facts, needs to get some wheels turning and making nuclear abolition happen, or at least some credible progress towards that goal. There have been statements at the UN that are also a reflection of this new push and this new effort grounded on humanitarian imperatives. These have grown in the number of endorsers, so to speak. The first one, I believe, it was like 75 or 80, then just over 100. The latest one, I think, was 163 at last count. This is at last year's General Assembly First Committee, which deals with disarmament and international security. And I'll get back to this later on, but just to let you know, Canada did not sign this statement that was put forth during First Committee, and it also did not sign the previous one or the early one. Yes, please.
Sorry, was 163 the number of countries
that endorsed the statement? There was one lead country, so to speak, which was New Zealand. And then before the statement was introduced, they worked behind the scenes to secure as many endorsements and give it the weight and the credibility that it deserves. And some of us have been in New York trying to engage with the Canadian delegation and trying to make the case why it would make sense and it would be entirely consistent with Canadian values and priorities to sign on to these pledges, but still they have not. So I'll talk a little bit about more about the Canadian case in particular later, but just to highlight that fact that we have not been part of these majority statements. And there has been an undeniable impact in the discourse. I mean, and you hear, if you pay attention to the statements, and these are all available online at these various NPT conferences or at the very conferences in Oslo, Nayarit, or Vienna, states are using this humanitarian language to ground their positions. They are almost verbatim taking some of the language that some civil society organizations use, I mean, to justify their positions, because they find this line of argument and this line of reasoning to be coherent and consistent with the goal, the international goal of nuclear abolition. Another issue to keep in mind for in general about the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime, but in particular as it again relates to the meeting in May in New York, to the 2015 review conference. the Middle East question. It has not gone away, and it will not go away between now and May. And if it does, then, I mean, that would be a great gain for international security, but I highly doubt it. In 1995, this question was crucial. This is a year when the NPT was extended indefinitely, and which was a relief for many in the international community, because its raison d'etre, its stated goals, had not been accomplished. They still have not. So it was good to keep this process going. And one of the thorny issues, and one of the elements without which most analysts coincide it wouldn't have been possible to secure the extension of the treaty, was to specifically address the Middle East question. And by Middle East question, the language says a zone in the Middle East free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. This was followed up in 2010 in the latest review conference, and not only did they make a mention of it, but surprisingly, because these documents are a lesson in vagueness and nothing concrete, surprisingly, they put a specific date for a conference to be convened precisely on this topic. So the fact that they ventured into suggesting a date made you think that there was a real likelihood of follow-up. They said by the end of 2012, there will be a conference on the topic of a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other WMDs. Sure enough, today, the conference that was supposed to be held by 2012 has still not been held. And Arab countries and countries in the region are increasingly impatient about this oversight, if you will, of the international community. So they've been pressing and pressing hard. During the last preparatory committee of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Egyptian delegation walked out halfway through the conference, and this is unprecedented in the history of NPT meetings, and they walked out specifically as a protest regarding the lack of progress towards solving the Middle East question. And the final thing I would say about this, yes, please?
Whose responsibility was it to get this conference going, or was it all the signatories?
No, it was all the signatories because it was a consensual document. But there were, I believe, the UK, the US, and Russia took it upon themselves as guarantors of this process. And there was an ambassador from Finland specifically tasked with moving this forward. And to his credit, this Finnish ambassador made an effort. That's the impression I have, and I know a lot of people share it. He traveled the world. He held meetings with several people. In the end, the reading of the situation that a lot of people had was that it was on the one hand, it was pointless to have this meeting if you didn't have both Iran and Israel on the table, and on the other, ambassador who was tasked with this was not able to get assurances that both Israel and Iran would be on the table. So this hasn't materialized, but at the same time, it has not gone away. And I highly doubt that Arab countries are going to stop pressing for this to happen. The problematic angle I find is what I call the chicken and egg conundrum with regards to the Middle East, which is there the expectation of strict sequencing involved here between, on the one hand, disarmament, actual disarmament of WMDs and nuclear weapons, and on the other hand, the peace, comprehensive peace that has long eluded the region. So I think it's very problematic if peace is framed as a precondition for disarmament and not the other way around. I believe that disarmament is a contributing element to the long desired peace. But if you frame it the other way around, what are the hopes and really what are the reasonable prospects of global disarmament if disarmament in just this one region will not happen until you reach peace? And you all know how likely that prospect is in the foreseeable future. So ideally there will be both, but I think in terms of sequencing, it's problematic to place comprehensive peace as a precondition for disarmament in the region. Third issue to be aware of: nuclear modernization. There are reports. This is, again, not speculation or hearsay or one organization's, you know, raising the alarm over nothing. This is well documented. The Washington Post, the Associated Press, the New York Times, I mean, they have covered this. Plans to spend billions, and some estimates put it in the trillions of dollars on modernization programs. This is highly problematic for obvious reasons. I mean, this is an investment. This is an investment, and as an investment, the expected result is that it will extend the shelf life of nuclear arsenals. So if you invest $1 billion, $1 trillion on nuclear arsenals, as a government, you probably want to see the investment through. So this will inevitably push the goalposts of abolition further and further down the road. But another conundrum. This is full of conundrums, and this is actually not unusual in nuclear disarmament. Answers are not always black and white, and it's all in the nuances, and it's all in the details. So don't we want to keep them safe? And this actually, I started thinking about this in Vienna out of a conversation that I was having with somebody. I mean, is our position a blanket rejection of modernization programs? I mean, because if it is, I mean, I think it begs some questions. I think there is nothing to like about modernization programs precisely because of the reasons I just exposed, and it will extend the lifetime of these arsenals by decades, if not centuries. However, this rejection is based on the promise that the alternative is elimination. You don't need to modernize them. Why spend $1 billion or $1 trillion if we're going to eliminate them? But that's a risky bet, because if elimination doesn't happen in the foreseeable future, and the arsenals are indeed rusty, generally speaking, then isn't there a question to be asked about the desirability of a blanket rejection on modernization programs if the weapons are still going to be lying around? Again, so there is no confusion. The preference, the obvious preference, is to not spend this money because we will see nuclear disarmament. But if we consider the possibility that it might not come as quick as we want, then there's a question what to do with what the press has reported as being a very dangerous situation with neglected arsenals. Phyllis, please.
Isn't operational dysfunction much more serious whether you modernize the arsenals or not? The people who are not properly trained, who don't carry out the safety measures that are supposed to, who use drugs and drink, and the demoralization that we are told has happened. You just need to read Eric Schlosser's book, and you're horrified that human beings with normal fallibilities are in charge of these weapons.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you raised this point, because the problem with modernization is not only a matter of following the money, but also following the people, the human beings, the very fallible human beings that are in charge of these programs. And Eric Schlosser's book and other media reports have pointed to a pattern of demoralization, of people who are discouraged, people who are just sitting there caring for this decades-old, awkward, big, useless arsenals that nonetheless could, very well destroy civilization and human life as we know it. So yes, there is also that. So the current state of existing arsenals has to raise a lot of questions. But again, just to throw in the caution that it may not always be as black and white as we might want it to be. Yes, please.
Just a quick question on the modernization. Are you saying that they're going to fundamentally keep the warhead and then rebuild the missiles that are housed in around them because they're rusting, which then just looking at the actual design of the missile itself, that means looking at the whole system that the missile itself is comprised of? So is that what you're saying, basically?
Right. that could be what I'm saying. I mean, I doubt there is a cookie cutter modernization approach to every single category of nuclear weaponry that a country has. I mean, there may be some systems that are in more dire need of a complete overhaul, while there are others that might just require a bit of a, you know, a nip here and a tuck there, or something like that. But I don't know the details beyond that. I mean, the specifics of the modernization. The point is that this money is slated to be spent, and that it's not speculation, and that once spent, governments, I think, out of a natural reaction, will be tempted to live out this new extended life of nuclear arsenals, and thereby the risk of accidental or deliberate use lingers for a few more decades to come. Yes, please.
Yeah, you know, like on 60 Minutes, they had, they went into one of the silos.
Right.
And it's like they seem to have stopped in timing, because like they had floppy disks about this size, and they had all of these other things, and it seemed like they you know, when they I guess tried to you know, with Gorbachev and Reagan, they had a détente, and they more or less started to reduce the numbers. Like all those old silos in the Midwest, you know, they all seem to stop modernization and stuff. Now, because of the increased friction now in Ukraine and that, all of a sudden they're saying, we're not going to get rid of these things. We're going to start updating them. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but I would say that the desire to invest heavily in modernization predates the Ukraine crisis. I mean, the Ukraine crisis may well, you know, accelerate the plans or the implementation of the plan. Perhaps, I don't know that to be a fact, but the plans predate the Ukraine crisis, and this is an investment that is going to be made irrespective of what's happening there. The flip side is that situation is obviously relevant for nuclear disarmament efforts, and it just serves to underscore how heightened tensions are not a good, you know, they do not bode well for the prospects of nuclear disarmament and for the prospects of non-use, for that matter. I mean, there is a real risk.
It looked like they were more dangerous resting in the Midwest, because like. Yeah,
right. No, I see your point. What I would say it's a multifaceted risk. There is a risk because they're rusting. There is a risk because the people who care for them are demoralized. There is a risk because of this situation in Ukraine. There is a risk because of human folly. There is a risk because of accidental use. There is a risk because of miscalculation. So these are very risky arsenals. And I think that serves to underscore the push for abolition, the desire for abolition, and just a rational sense of human survival. I mean, based on the recognition of these very real risks that are not narrowed down to this one risk or this other risk, but they're compounded by their mutual existence of these different categories of risk, and that is what's driving the push.
They only had one tool for about 15 silos, and they had to air freight it from one place to the other.
Right.
To recalibrate something.
Yes, and there are several stories like that, and that's why I'm confident in saying that the risks have been very well documented, and there are papers or documents just on close calls, just on near misses, just in situations that could have gone horribly wrong. I mean, there is such a thing as a scenario that neither party wants, and they still get there. There are people who specialize on the nature of escalation and how you can arrive at an outcome that no one desires, but it's still possible together. So what I think the nuclear disarmament movement wants to take out that possibility. Okay, and sometimes you find yourself making the very odd, bizarre argument that, you know, you can still kill each other and you have a lot of conventional strength. Just let's take out this possibility of nuclear catastrophe. Yes, please.
I don't want to interrupt the train of your wonderful presentation. I know of people, and you probably do, at the UN and otherwise, who have spent their whole lives working for this. One gentleman, his name was William Epstein, and he devoted, I think, the last 30 years of his life. In the meantime, we are all the victims of nuclear terrorism. And that is the situation of humanity. Now, this means that in actual fact, Toronto could be the target, if things go awry, of a nuclear missile, and people like me would be perfectly pulverized. So I simply want to raise this question that it's, in my view, it's deliberate on the part of various powers,
right,
which includes the big money. And they keep delaying and deferring, and in the meantime, we're all at risk continually of nuclear annihilation.
Absolutely.
Perhaps you might be kind enough to just comment briefly on
yes,
that.
Thank you. Not much to say beyond that I agree with that assessment. And I mean, I'm glad you raised the possibility of nuclear terrorism, because even in that dreadful scenario, existing nuclear weapons would again be essentially useless. I mean, look at the classic example is 9/11, 2001, and you have the country that has the most nuclear weapons in the world, the most powerful nation in the world, and they're attacked. How useful are these nuclear weapons? They're completely useless. Who do you target? And these entrenched beliefs in deterrence and the notion that if you have them, people will not attack you, I mean, are just thrown out the window. And it's not just because they're terrorists. I mean, there are countless examples of nuclear weapons not deterring as they're supposed to, and non-nuclear weapon states still daring to attack or engage in conflict countries that have them, because deterrence is not this infallible notion that it is sometimes made out to be. Moving on. A fourth issue that I think is important for you to consider and keep in mind, NATO. There's so much wrong and contradictory about NATO's nuclear policy and our own Canadian linkages to NATO that it's really hard not to see NATO as a whole as a hindrance today towards nuclear abolition, as an obstacle to nuclear abolition. So we have these notions, these Cold War era notions of extended deterrence and nuclear umbrellas, whereby basically countries that do not have nuclear weapons are still arguably protected by nuclear weapons, because the states who do have nuclear weapons make them available. And so in this language, this NATO alliance language of collective security arrangements and again nuclear umbrellas, an attack against non-nuclear weapon states could be considered to be an attack against a nuclear weapon states, and the response could be nuclear. And they do have that possibility open of using nuclear weapons. What is the problem? It's not only that this wholly undermines nuclear disarmament efforts. It's not only that members of the alliance would never take a comparable yet opposite situation where Russia would station some of its nuclear weapons in countries that are closer geographically to its historical rival. I mean, that would never pass. But they do it with such apparent normalcy that they, you know, it's business as usual for them. But it's not only these obvious contradictions, but it's also that it contravenes the spirit and letter of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Blatantly. In your face, in my face, in our face. They just do it. Article 1, do not transfer nuclear weapons. Article 2, do not receive nuclear weapons. And they still do it. I mean, there is really no shame, but it still is, it's quite peculiar how they just go ahead and do it and share their nuclear weapons in clear contravention of the present spirit and letter of the NPT. So this leads to a certain duality of non-nuclear weapon states, NATO members, and Canada is a case in point. So you have the apparent benefits of being a responsible, international citizen, and you can claim on the world stage that you are, by your own decision, a non-nuclear weapon state, that you could have been nuclear, but nonetheless you decided to remain non-nuclear. while at the same time you're a member of an alliance that has an overt, explicit policy of nuclear deterrence, and that nobody believes for 1 second that the nuclear weapons are not to be used. Because this is their argument. They are saying that this bizarre notion that the weapons are more the use of the weapons is intended to be more political than military. But at the same time, everybody knows that they have to be willing to use them because otherwise their bluff will be called. So you can't have weapons and have people believing that when the time comes you will not actually use them, because then any benefit is evaporated. So there has to be a willingness to use them. There is no two ways about this. So NATO, very problematic and not only problematic but also against the precepts and the provisions of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Fifth, commercial versus security interests. So here I'm talking about questionable nuclear cooperation agreements that are contributing factors to heightening the risk of proliferation, whether horizontal, that is with states that don't have nuclear weapons, or vertical, states that have them but they want more. And these are both to be discouraged, horizontal or vertical. So the most immediate example, we don't need to go far. Canada. Canada has entered into nuclear cooperation agreements with India and with China, both signed by the current government. What is problematic about them? The nature is a little bit different, but on the whole, there is a lot of secrecy surrounding these agreements, and they are to be governed not by what is expected to be the golden international standard, which is, IAEA safeguards, that is the International Atomic Energy Agency, but actually ad hoc administrative arrangements that the Canadian public cannot know what they are. So we are essentially asked to trust that these agreements of nuclear cooperation are conducted in a safe manner. But if you take a step back, you realize that there are arguments to question the very fact that there is a nuclear cooperation agreement with India in the first place. For example, why would you have a nuclear cooperation agreement with a country that is a rogue nuclear state, one of the 4 outside of the nearly universal Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, who has nuclear weapons against the will of the international community, who has resisted calls to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and who we know has domestic needs for nuclear energy that will be alleviated with Canadian uranium, and thereby they will be able to allocate some of their domestic supply for military purposes. So if it sounded confusing, a little bit confusing, it's because it is. But essentially what we have is a situation where Canada tells us Canadian uranium is not going to end up in a weapon. What we're saying is, yes, that may be the case, although we really don't know because the assurances are secret. But even if that were the case, what you cannot deny is that Canadian uranium will alleviate the pressure on India for its domestic energy needs, and India will be able to allocate its own supply for military needs. So there, it's problematic. And again, in the deal with China, Canada chose to skirt IAEA involvement. It's baffling why in such a trade in such a sensitive material as uranium you would choose to skirt IAEA involvement, but Canada did just that. And now the deal is instead governed by, again, secret arrangements that the public knows nothing about.
Is that the FIPA? Is that wrapped up in the FIPA that we did with China?
Excuse me?
Well, there's a FIPA agreement. I'm just wondering whether the nuclear was wrapped in with that FIPA agreement.
Right. I think it was done separately. Yeah. 6 states outside of the NPT. This relates a little bit to what I mentioned about India. So there are 4 states outside of the NPT: India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. The first 3 have never been part of the NPT. North Korea withdrew in 2003. The problem is that although we and several people, observers, routinely refer to the NPT as this nearly universal treaty, and I've used it myself during this talk, in fact, the reality is that when it comes to states that actually have nuclear weapons, nearly universal is not a description that is accurate by far. It's roughly half and half, half in and half out. 5 have nuclear weapons inside the NPT framework, 4 have them outside of the NPT framework. So this begs the question, if that is the case, that is an undisputed reality, of course, is the NPT really the framework that is going to take us to abolition? You might say, yes, if you got these four states to join the NPT. But again, it's easier said than done. Among other reasons, because the international community and countries like Canada are incentivizing the status quo by making nuclear deals with countries like India, even if they're outside of the NPT. No authoritative observer today would believe that it's likely that these 4 states will join the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states, in other words, giving up their weapons. But these observers would also not believe that the international community would accept them if they kept their nuclear weapons. So in other words, we are it's a deadlock situation with these 4 states outside of the NPT, and the reality is that any process that takes us to abolition has to be broader than the current state of affairs with the NPT. Another situation to be aware of that I think is critical, and I think it's important to pay attention to, civil society activism. And it's honestly, I'm always impressed, and my hat's off to people in Canada internationally that are working very diligently, very tirelessly to advance this goal of nuclear abolition. We have ICANN, we have Abolition 2000, Global Zero, Unfold Zero, Mayors for Peace. That's internationally. In Canada, we have the Canadian Network to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and I see some familiar faces here of people that I know support that effort. We have the Canadians for a Nuclear Weapons Convention, which is this gathering of more than 750 recipients of the Order of Canada, which is the highest distinction in the land, who are telling the government to act to assume a leading role in global efforts towards nuclear disarmament. Of course, it has fallen on deaf ears, but it is not because the government hasn't been told this or because it hasn't been properly articulated. It has been articulated in many times and packaged in many different ways, and still it has fallen on deaf ears. And I'll say a little bit more about the Canadian specific circumstances in a bit. But what you can see is growing the fact that civil society activism is growing in effectiveness, in sophistication, in intensity, in numbers. So it's really quite a sight, and some of you, if you follow this issue, you will have noticed over the past couple of years, perhaps, you know, more emails, more banners, more things coming into your life with information about the humanitarian impact, for example, about the different campaigns that are pushing for nuclear abolition right now the world over. So it's really a positive development. I mean, this growing effectiveness, but the reality at the same time is that the decision-making venues and forums in multilateral diplomacy and multilateral politics remain state-centric. So I mean, it is helpful, and it does help to have a very active, very engaged civil society, but these decisions are political and they are state-centric. So at some point, we also need to engage, you know, the powers that be. Another issue that I think is important to keep in mind in the current context is the Marshall Islands lawsuit. So this is the RMI, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, filed 2 separate lawsuits. One against all nuclear weapons states in the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. So again, 5 inside the NPT framework, 4 outside. And I mean, there's intricacies to this and you know, legalese, etc. But essentially, it was for breach of Article 6, and this, peculiarly enough, covered even those states outside of the NPT. By Article 6, I mean Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is widely known as the disarmament article, which is the one that imposes the obligation to make progress in good faith towards a nuclear weapons-free world. So they are holding the position that even the four that are outside of the NPT are bound because this obligation to disarm has gradually become customary international law, and everyone is under the obligation to again engage in good faith negotiations towards nuclear disarmament. The Marshall Islands filed a separate lawsuit in U.S. Federal District Court in San Francisco, I believe. And this was a little bit different. I mean, it was also related to breach of Article 6, but it was specifically because 67 nuclear weapons tests were conducted in the Marshall Islands from 1946 to 1958. Recently, however, there was a news item just a couple of days ago that a U.S. judge in San Francisco, I believe, dismissed the lawsuit, the separate lawsuit that was filed just against the United States in U.S. District Court, and essentially found the lawsuit to be without merit. It's hard to understand, I mean, the rationale that they used, but it's not entirely surprising. But I think it's important to know what the relationship was between the Marshall Islands and the United States, just to underscore how important and how much merit indeed this lawsuit has. I mean, the Marshall Islands was a trust territory of the United States. The United States was the trustee. You are entrusted with the well-being of this territory. So it's really adding insult to injury. It's not just, it would have been reprehensible enough had it been nuclear tests in some random island or atoll or wherever nuclear tests are conducted. But this is in a territory that was entrusted to you by the international system to care for its well-being. And this is what the United States did. It did more than 60 tests that left, and they are still felt profound physical, health, and environmental consequences. So it's really hard to see how you can find a lawsuit for this reason to be without merit.
Wouldn't there be some fiduciary requirements linked in with that as well?
Yes, but I think from the Marshall Islands perspective, they are not seeking any sort of compensation, which I think adds to the moral righteousness, if you will, of their cause. They are not seeking monetary compensation. They just want the 9 nuclear weapon states to undertake serious negotiations towards nuclear abolition. That's all they want. And in fact, I believe that the judge who dismissed the lawsuit in the United States said that by engaging in serious nuclear disarmament negotiations, there would be no redress for the Marshall Islands. I mean, for the environmental and health effects that they felt. So I think that was part of the rationale for finding it without merit. But yeah, they are not seeking compensation.
That doesn't make sense to me, but
they have received some.
The what?
They have received compensation in the past.
Right, but I think this series of lawsuits, these two that are making news, are at least the primary goal is not to seek compensation. But my understanding is that they're not seeking compensation at all with these.
No, I agree with you.
Okay. Okay, 9 out of 10. So we're getting there. Issues that I think is important to keep in mind in the current context: the ban proposal, and this is actually quite an interesting discussion. We could probably have a separate session just on the ban proposal. Suffice it to say that I did not want to bundle it with the humanitarian initiative on purpose. I mean, they are somewhat related, but they are not necessarily one and the same. In other words, you can be, as I know people who are, very supportive of the humanitarian initiative, of the humanitarian imperative for nuclear disarmament, but still you know, not be all in with this ban idea, but still support, you know, the humanitarian imperative as a rationale for disarmament. There are others who have made it, you know, their key proposal, their key calling on governments, this ban proposal. So what are we talking about? This language, ban has always been part of the nuclear disarmament discourse, but in the past few years, in the context of the humanitarian initiative, it started, you know, people started having to differentiate between what different possible meanings. So it's, you know, it's a rose is a rose is a rose. So a ban is a ban is a ban. There are various ways in which a ban could be understood. I mean, you could have a ban with, or with a ban could mean to be a process with or without the involvement of the P5, which these are the sole possessors of nuclear weapons within the NPT. A ban could be a ban on use or a ban on possession, the latter being more comprehensive. And a ban could also conceivably include or leave out specific provisions for disarmament. And this will be relevant in particular if the second question is answered no, I mean the first question is answered without the P5. So if it's a process without the involvement of the P5, this begs the question, will it nonetheless include provisions for actual elimination if you don't have anyone on the table that actually has nuclear weapons? So there are, you know, various combinations that you could have. My understanding is that the proposal that has taken, you know, more strength and notoriety, etc., is a ban proposal without the involvement of the P5 against possession, and leaving open the question of whether or not it should include provisions. So this is a ban proposal. I think when it comes down to it, the key point is this notion of moving forward without the involvement of the P5, who would nonetheless be invited to participate in this process. Some people, purists, if you will, of nuclear disarmament, were taken aback a little bit with this proposal because the call has routinely for years been for a nuclear weapons convention. I mean, a full-fledged process with a universal process with the involvement of states with nuclear weapons that will be, you know, the end game to the nuclear disarmament problem. Some sectors of civil society, notably the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, started pushing the idea that, you know what, if in the current scenario it's unlikely, almost impossible, to count on the P5 for a serious disarmament process, the international community should be able to proceed anyway without them and create the conditions and set some normative value by an explicit prohibition of nuclear weapons, even if everybody knows and admits that at some point the involvement of P5 will be necessary. So I think it's all fair. I mean the more creativity, I mean, there is in terms of proposals, the better. It's a matter of whether these proposals can coexist or whether they are, you know, actually hurting each other's chances and pulling in different directions. My personal view is that the ban is entirely consistent with the long-held goal of a nuclear weapons convention. My caveat is that the ban is not the only conceivable way of getting to a nuclear weapons convention. Yes, it's one way, and I think it would be a positive contribution in this effort in clarifying and opening up debate in raising the public profile of the issue. Whether the ban happens or not, in the end, there might still be benefit, even if it does not. So it's one way forward, but I think there's a fair argument to be made by somebody who might say, you know, yes, but there might be other ways to get to the goal we know is the end goal, which is a full-fledged nuclear weapons convention. A risk that I see, and I highlighted in my last point here, a fractured civil society message is that and I'm not saying this is the case right now, but it could be the case, is that civil society might seem a bit erratic in making the case for nuclear disarmament and answering the question from governments, okay, what next? What is your proposal? Where do we go now? And governments getting different answers depending on whom they are posing the question to. In the back.
You talked about the NPT and the convention and the ban. Could you just clarify the differences?
Okay, yes. So, well, the NPT is a treaty itself, and some countries, a recurring talking point about the NPT, I mean, specifically the linkage of the NPT to abolition, a recurring talking point by countries, including Canada, including the P5, is that we should not abandon the NPT, that the world is better off with the NPT than without it. I fully agree, but I also add, this is not, the way it's currently structured and implemented, this is not the roadmap or process or structure that will lead to global zero. It's just not, because among other reasons it's not universal, but it isn't the way it's currently structured. So that's the NPT. In terms of the ban versus the Nuclear Weapons Convention, I would say the key distinction, the way they are understood currently, is that the ban is something that could proceed, like a ban on possession could proceed without the involvement of nuclear weapon states. And the Nuclear Weapons Convention necessitates the nuclear weapon states because they are the ones that are, in the end, going to give up their weapons. And I think an underlying premise here in this notion of a Nuclear Weapons Convention as an end game, as the necessary requirement that the P5 are actually involved in the process, and the 4 outside the NPT, of course, as well. Everybody has to be in. Is that you can't, in the end, no matter how well the case is made, how well the case is articulated, you really cannot force the P5 to disarm. I mean, in the end, they have to come to the table voluntarily and disarm. I mean, among other reasons, because they're stronger than the rest of us. So they have to come in. And what I think is frustrating and problematic is that this exceptionalism that we sometimes complain about, it's not just, you know, arrogance or that they think that they are exceptional. It's that they are. That this exceptionalism is actually embedded in international law. Even if you wanted to change the letter of the NPT to make more explicit the obligation to disarm, you need buy-in from the P5. Even if you wanted to change the process by which you can amend the NPT, you need buy-in from the P5 to approve that process. If you wanted to amend the Charter of the United Nations so that it's more conducive and there's less room for ambiguity about the obligation to disarm, you need the acquiescence of the P5, because without them, nothing can happen. So we are, and not to sound too, you know, overkill, dramatic, or realpolitik, but that is the way I see it. I mean, it is embedded into international law. I mean, they are exceptional because they are exceptional in the end. So you do, this is all to say, you need them at the end. Whether you're an advocate of the ban, of moving forward without the P5, or whether you're a purist that says it has to be, I mean, it doesn't matter. Everybody agrees. In the end, the states with nuclear weapons have to come to the table and be willing to give up their nuclear arsenals. And finally, what about Canada? What is our government doing, and where do we stand? So there are various talking points that are recurring and that you find when you examine Canadian positions and Canadian statements. But I think the key one, or the one that sort of summarizes everything, is that they insist on what they call a pragmatic step-by-step approach. What do they mean like this, or what do we understand by this? First of all, they often use the word pragmatic in front of this step-by-step approach, and apparently they have this idea that by calling it pragmatic, they make it so. But it is really hard to see the pragmatism in an approach that, as I said, 7 decades after the bomb was used, more than almost half a century after the NPT came into force, has delivered nothing and has prompted and would prompt no one to foresee actual nuclear abolition in the next half a century. So our skepticism about this step-by-step approach is not bad faith about the future. It's not a prejudice. It's not speculative in the sense of it may or may not work. No, it's that there is historical evidence. We know exactly for a fact that it has not worked. So that is why there is this reluctance to embrace it, and there is the suggestion, the strong suggestion and call and urging the government to try something different because this frankly has not worked. What steps do they mean? What steps does this step-by-step notion capture? It captures steps like by the way, it's not just Canada that pushes it, this sense to echo exactly, to almost to the letter, the position of nuclear weapon states, which is baffling in its own right. But what steps do these countries mean? They mean steps like the entry into force of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which some of these states that call for step-by-steps have not ratified, like the United States, for example. Another step is an FMCT, a Fissile Material Cut-off Treaty, which is negotiated at the Conference on Disarmament, which strangely has not operated as a functioning disarmament body the way it should be for more than 15 years. Steps like a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, for which a meeting was supposed to be held by the end of 2012, and today it's a day that it has not yet been held. These are the steps that they're talking about. So the credibility and again the supposed pragmatism is very hard to see in this position. There has been from Canada lukewarm support for the humanitarian initiative and a bit of internal contradictions in the way they embrace it and understand it. I say lukewarm because they have, to be fair, been in Oslo and Nayarit and in Vienna. So that has to be recognized, and they were there and they made a statements. But they used the opportunity to while there to challenge the notion that a prohibition of nuclear weapons is necessary. To say that, yeah, well, that's not going to guarantee that their elimination, which is, I guess, true, but it's also true that at some point it's a necessary step toward the elimination of nuclear weapons. So yeah, that's essentially the step-by-step position of Canada. Canada, again, is a member of NATO, so there are some inherent contradictions there. As I said earlier, non-nuclear weapon state on the one hand, but also supportive of a nuclear alliance on the other hand. There is parliamentary resolution, and there is strong public support. And I bring these two into the conversation because at a certain point you wonder, okay, the facts are on the table, it's undisputed, the consequences would be catastrophic, there would be no effective emergency relief. Canada would play and should play a crucial role. I mean, it's a member of the G7, the G20, it has a nuclear energy industry, it has or used to have international credibility on various matters. And so what do you do? So you ask yourself and you think, okay, let's go to Parliament. Perhaps, I mean, that will nudge them a little bit. So there was a parliamentary resolution across party lines. I mean, and it was unanimous and asking the government in no ambiguous terms to embrace the Secretary General's 5-point plan. This is a plan that essentially says, okay, real progress is needed toward nuclear disarmament, and to launch a major global diplomatic initiative toward toward the elimination of nuclear weapons. I mean, Parliament, even the government's own party was in on this, and it was again all the parties, and nothing, no follow-up there. There is public support. There are polls that say you know, a vast majority of Canadians would support this. There's, you know, the work of non-governmental organizations across the country. The message is clear. This isn't an area like conventional weapons, which even within civil society tends to be more divisive, and you have, you know, pro-regulation and anti-regulation, and you have sports shooters, and you have people who want regulation. No, the message on nuclear disarmament is very consistent, what they're getting from us, the government here. There is no, you know, sectors of civil society calling for the perpetuation of nuclear weapons, or for there isn't anything like that, as there really in other realms where there are profound disagreements. Here, we're all on the same page, generally speaking, with nuances, and yet it has fallen on deaf ears, and it has prompted literally, I mean, no change in attitude or position from the Canadian government. So when you go to these forums, these humanitarian initiative conferences, or UN-related MPT events, I mean, you talk to people, and whether within governments or civil society, and they have taken notice, and Canada is now assumed or expected to be a fringe minority position. If there is a statement on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, I mean, it's almost to be expected that if this is a majority statement, 160 nations plus, Canada will be with the nuclear weapon states, you know, as a counterweight to these majority statements. So it really leaves a lot to be desired. So on that happy note, I think I'm going to wrap it up and wrap it up temporarily, but I'm still available for follow-up questions. Thank you.
Fabulous.